Good afternoon. This is U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Ken Westlake speaking.
And this is Craig Stellmacher here from the uptake.org. Why don't we start?
Great. Karen Thompson from our Public Affairs office is in the room with me.
Okay, great. Why don't we start a little bit with your background, Ken, please, and your official position?
Okay. I manage the Environmental Review Program for the Region 5 office. My formal title is Chief of the National Environmental Policy Act Implementation Section. A mouthful, but the deep implementation section, and that's here at U.S. EPA Region 5. So we cover the 6 states of the Western Great Lakes Basin in our office.
Thank you so much. I think it's really important to talk to you. I saw 12 hours of Senate hearings this week on this issue, and I thought if there was one witness we didn't have, it was you. And in fact, 2 senators heavily supported your letter and kept bringing it up and wouldn't let it go away. But other people dismissed it entirely. I thought I wanted to hear what you had to say about your letter.
Well, we obviously stand behind it as an agency. Our review process involved a team of regional and headquarters technical reviewers in a variety of different disciplines, led by a woman on my staff who's a geologist, and we had people who specialize in wetlands, in water quality, in water permits, in air permits. We had a participant from our national mining team. We had some involvement from our tribal office, and we even hired a contractor to assist us with some hydrogeological issues where we felt we didn't have enough in-house capabilities in the time that we needed them. So this letter is the result of a great deal of intensive review. We've had involvement in this project for approximately 5 years, from the earliest times that the Corps of Engineers and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources declared their intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. We provided what we call scoping comments to help define what we thought needed to be studied.
This letter is rather at odds with their assessment. I wonder, shouldn't really shock them then. Some of these objections were probably delivered earlier than February 18th. Is that correct?
I was just going to mention that. In addition to the scoping comments we produced at the start of the process, we also had an opportunity to review 2 earlier drafts of this EIS. We generated comments in February and August of this past year. And most of the issues that we raised in our letter on February 18th echoed issues that we've been raising throughout the process.
Do you want to go through them and maybe in order of importance or order of the letter? I guess maybe perhaps the 3 most important is maybe where we should start, unless you have some other logic there.
No, that's fine. In fact, if you looked at our letter, you probably saw that the lengthy attachment covered a wide variety of issues beyond just what we highlighted in our cover letter. So our cover letter focused on the issues of greatest importance to us, particularly as it impacted what rating we gave the project.
And I hear that this is a rather rare rating that isn't given out very often.
It is. Certainly the first time a Region 5 project has received this rating in my 9+ years in my current position. And I think we've only done 7 adverse ratings in Region 5 total since our national database was created in 1987.
What really shakes you then, and what are the primary reasons for that low rating? Is it the financial assurance? Is it the mercury in water? Is it the lack of modeling? Where do we go to really understand that rating?
I would say that the most compelling issue from our point of view is the admission in the draft EIS that this project will violate state and tribal water quality standards.
It's interesting to see that in writing, yes.
Pardon?
It's interesting to see that in writing, or that you overflow in 65 years, or these are interesting little points that are sort of just glossed over.
Well, I mean, we understand. We have this responsibility to do an independent review of other agencies, other federal agencies' environmental impact statements, and we take that process seriously. Not only did we have to pull together this interdisciplinary team to conduct the review, but then we had to get our draft comments concurred on by senior executives here in Chicago as well as in Washington. So this is a collaborative effort where the senior management of the agency signed off on it.
Let's talk a little bit about the modeling. How about we bring that up? I saw some interesting models presented this week, but they were mainly above ground rock, and they were watched for years, over a decade, but we didn't really model much about putting the rock underwater to see if we could cut off oxygen that way. I haven't seen those models really yet where we put the material back in the pit and hope that it doesn't leak after that.
Well, we know that sulfide ore can generate acid rock discharge or acid mine drainage. Both terms are used pretty interchangeably.
Yes.
And one of the key recommendations we make in our letter is that we think there needs to be additional studies of the interface between the project materials, surface water, and groundwater to figure out just what's happening with groundwater and surface water. What's the volume of water to be discharged? What's the chemical composition to be discharged? And what options might be considered to reduce the risk of discharge such that you wouldn't have predicted violations of water quality standards.
Could you explain to all of us, really, how much sulfur is in this rock? Because I've heard various figures, and let's start with maybe someone who doesn't know a thing about it, really. How much sulfur is in this rock relative to other rock? Because many people like to compare it to the Flandreau mine at Lily-Smith, Wisconsin, or other mines. Where are we for sulfur here?
I don't have that data at hand, so I don't want to quote a figure.
We like to hear we hear again and again here in Minnesota that it's relatively low sulfur. We like to hear that phrase again and again in the Senate hearings, that it isn't really that much sulfur to worry about.
Well, it's really a question of what's going to be mobilized into the environment as a result of the project activities. And as I say, we had geologists and hydrogeologists looking at the project when we were generating our comments. I don't know off the top of my head what the sulfur concentrations are for this ore body, but I do know that those people who did review the project were very concerned about not only the sulfide leaching into groundwater and surface water, but also how the sulfur-based acids that come from this kind of rock can mobilize heavy metals. You mentioned mercury, certainly copper, nickel, zinc. There are a variety of heavy metals that can be mobilized.
Do we have cadmium up there also? Another toxic heavy metal.
I'm not sure about cadmium. I know cobalt is one of the other minerals that they're hoping to recover.
Mm-hmm. But it's quite a soup up there. It's very complex.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, you find a mix of metals in an ore body like this, so that's why the company is proposing to recover not just copper and nickel, but also platinum, gold, cobalt, what they call the precious metals group.
One of our ways of trying to make this safe is to sort the rock into 4 different piles as we go and try and determine how much sulfur or other toxins are in it. But I noticed that you don't think that they're really going to be able to do that accurately in real time. They don't really have much of a plan to do that.
Well, we certainly want them to explain in much more detail how they're actually going to implement that in the field. They present that as a concept that they're going to segregate different concentrations of sulfur-bearing rock in different areas and treat them according to their potential to generate these contaminants. But one of the things we asked is, so how are you actually going to assay the rock in real time so that you can be assured that as this material is being excavated and I'm sure they're going to be using explosives to break the rock apart before they recover it and process it. Are they going to have a sampling plan that provides for good assurance that the rock pile that they say is going to be low in sulfur will in fact be low in sulfur? I think, as a theory, it may have some merit, but you have to really flesh out how is it going to work in practice. And we don't think the document spoke very thoroughly about how that particular approach was going to work in practice.
This seems interesting in that it sort of mirrors the idea of subaqueous disposal, because they both seem like really good ideas. But neither one of them has the, shall we say, experience of actually doing it before, or maybe a plan laid out in front of it to actually do it well.
Well, and that's why we think there's a lot of detail that should have been in this document that wasn't there.
We have one last thing which I think maybe is really important, and this is what I got to see all week here, is Senator Jim Carlson presented what is known as the Financial Assurance Bill. Mm-hmm. Now, this bill actually came up a year ago and didn't even receive a single hearing. This year, he gave the first 10 minutes of 12 hours of meetings, and then he was brought back again and again. And here's a surprise that at 15 minutes before 12 hours of hearings are up, he withdraws his bill. And I saw it basically lacerated at this hearing. Many people were strongly against the idea of financial assurance. How could we possibly need more? And they had made the decision, it looked like maybe a year ago or more, to support this idea of the project. And they weren't going to let this stand in the way. Senator Carlson would then defend his bill, saying, I don't really want to stop the mine. I think my bill is actually rather vague and is supportive of the mine. I just want some financial assurance for the future. So I think in a way of, I've seen openness from so many organizations, but I feel like if anyone has let us down, I think maybe our senators have without pushing this bill forward. How does the EPA feel about this issue of financial assurance?
Well, first of all, we don't have any position on the Minnesota bill. It's not our place to take a stand on a piece of state legislation. I will tell you that our agency is in the early stages of federal rulemaking for financial assurance for the hard rock mining industry. And that's because we've seen too many instances around the country historically where mine sites have turned into hazardous waste cleanup sites and public liabilities, in part because there wasn't sufficient financial assurance in place to guarantee that proper closure and post-closure care could occur with the necessary resources.
What kind of funds or what kind of instruments do we need to feel safe about the NorthMet project?
Well, understand, we know that there's existing state requirements under the Minnesota mining permit process for there to be some level of financial assurance. Our most fundamental unhappiness on that topic with the draft EIS is that there was almost no explanation of how financial assurance would work in the case of this project. And essentially, I think the agencies who wrote the EIS opted to defer that discussion to the permitting process, and we felt, and we've said this all along, that it ought to be included in the environmental impact statement, and for this reason. You can't really determine what the long-term environmental impacts of a project will be unless the project describes in some detail what the practices will be used to close it, to monitor and manage it after it's closed, and what kinds of financial resources will be put in place to guarantee that those things happen. We think that's a pretty fundamental part of determining what a project's long-term environmental impact will be, and therefore we thought it should be in the environmental impact statement itself and not deferred until some future permitting action.
Have any senators contacted your office at all from Minnesota?
Not individual legislators. We did get a contact from committee staff for the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee. So we were invited to participate in those hearings earlier this week.
I would have liked to have seen more science myself. I think most of the testimony was actually economic. I can't recount how many politicians of some sort said, I represent Hibbing or the Chamber of Commerce from here or there, who said this is the essential need up north. So I think that mainly they were looking at the economics of this project and saw it as positive. The science rather worried me.
Well,
go ahead.
Understand this. Even though we gave this project a severe rating and had as you've seen from reading our letter, a long list of things where we thought there were unacceptable environmental impacts and where the document itself was inadequate. We are very much prepared to work with the Corps of Engineers and the Minnesota DNR as the lead agencies, and with the company and with other co-regulators such as the State Pollution Control Agency to look for ways that our issues could be resolved.
So you think it's still doable if we address these issues?
Well, I mean, I don't know for a fact whether every last issue can be resolved. We're certainly going to do our best to explore those things. As you know, what's feasible is not just a technical question; it's also an economic question.
Right.
And you know, I'm sure the company has their own internal metrics for deciding you know, what they're trying to get out of this project in terms of value, and that will drive in part what they think is affordable or not affordable in terms of environmental controls. But we want to see particularly the water quality up there protected. And right now, this project, as currently proposed, doesn't do that.
We have many positives, or at least one often positive thing we hear cited is reusing the abandoned LTV processing plant. But at the same time, we see in your letter that there's interesting questions there as to whether that actually could take on more waste. That more waste actually might actually be a weight that it couldn't bear.
Well, you've got an existing processing facility, and you also have tailings basins at the old LTV processing site.
Do we understand that tailings basin very well?
I think it needs more study, and we talk about that in our letter. The existing tailings basin has seeps, so it's leaking. There are a number of street areas in the tailings basin vicinity that are going through the state voluntary investigation and cleanup program as possible hazardous waste sites. And we don't have a good sense of whether or not the tailings basin could physically handle the additional volume and weight of the processing waste, the tailings that would come from this new project. So there's an awful lot of unanswered questions regarding that tailings basin.
How can we assess that better?
I think there's some additional investigation that needs to be done there.
And what kind of investigation would that entail? Should we make drillings? And I always think that experiments cancel out modeling. Experiments trump modeling. And so if maybe we're relying on models for that, what experiments could we actually do with that basin to learn more about it? More drilling to look at underneath it?
Right now, as I understand it, there are only a handful of monitoring wells at the tailings basin, and given that there are multiple seeps occurring right now, we think there needs to be a lot more a broader monitoring network of surface water, groundwater monitors in the vicinity of that tailings basin. The question of whether or not the basin, as conceived, can hold the volume and weight of this material over the course of the North Met Mine project, that needs further analysis. So there are a number of unanswered questions regarding the tailings basin, and also begs the question: could they manage that material at some alternate location that doesn't present the current problems that the existing tailings basin is incurring?
They may actually want to put more in that basin than just this one mine. It looks like they want to go up the road or up the railroad track to the northeast. They also brag that they'll have excess capacity at the LTV plant, indicating that they really would like another mine to come online behind this project.
We are aware that there are other proposals under early development in this so-called Duluth complex, which is the ore body, the sulfide ore body that the North Met mine would be tapping into. This is the first copper-nickel sulfide ore mine proposed for northeastern Minnesota, but that ore body is pretty extensive. So there are others there are other projects that are in the early stages of development. So it may very well be that this area may be subject to numerous proposals down the road.
I have really just one more question for you, which is the future. But before we get to that, do you have any other specific worries that you want to bring up to me?
Well, I mean, we talked about the tailings basin. We talked about the acid mine drainage and the impacts on water quality. We also have, as a major concern, the need for additional wetlands mitigation. This project is going to cause the loss of about 1,000 acres of wetland, most of which is forested or bog. Very difficult.
I know that people write that off, but that's our main filter in biology, isn't it? That is a main water filter of how we clean water.
Wetlands have a lot of important functions, including water quality benefit, including flood water storage, habitat, and those functions all have to be replaced as part of the mitigation process that's required under the Clean Water Act permit that the Corps has authority to act on.
A couple things about wetlands. They're already acidic anyway. I would imagine you've got a low pH out there in the wetland north of the tailings basin. And there's something extraordinary in northern Minnesota we should point out to everyone. The water is incredibly soft. There's no buffers in it. So a little acid goes a long way in northern Minnesota.
And I don't know offhand what the pH measurements are in any one of the wetlands that's going to be impacted. There are a number of individual wetland complexes that are covered by the footprint of this project, and also potentially affected indirectly through dewatering. So we think there needs to be a lot more done on describing and committing to a wetland mitigation program that will more fully compensate for the losses that this project would impose on the wetland resources up there.
I always hear the solution to this is land swapping. Could you explain what that means exactly, that we have to go and find some other wetland and declare it and then we're okay?
Well, a couple things. First of all, the wetlands program requires that in order for a permit to be issued, the wetland resources have to be avoided, then minimized, and then mitigated in that sequence. The project has proposed wetland mitigation, not in the Lake Superior watershed, but in the Mississippi River watershed. So that's a concern for us. We know that they'll have to come up with an adequate amount of wetland mitigation, and it ought to be of similar types of wetlands. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to
It's hard to think of it as a net
even
system,
forested wetlands, you have to wait a generation or more before the forest functions are fully reestablished. So as a result of the difficulty and the time lag in mitigating forested wetlands and bogs, we're asking the applicant and the Corps of Engineers to use a higher mitigation ratio than what they might otherwise use. In other words, to create additional compensation for the wetlands that will be lost.
Are you very familiar?
In the land swap, let me get back to that for a second.
Sure.
Currently, the proposed mine site is in the ownership of the National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service.
Yes.
Part of Superior National Forest. The Polymet company owns the mineral rights, but they don't control the surface rights. And the Forest Service regards open pit mining as an incompatible use on that particular parcel. Therefore, in order for the mineral rights to be exploited here, the Forest Service would have to divest itself of that property and have some other land brought into the forest as compensation. So that's where the concept of a land swap occurs. That is not something that's yet been settled. In fact, the Forest Service would have to do its own environmental impact statement on any proposed land swap. And one of the things we suggested in our letter is that they fold that element of the project into this document because we see them as connected actions. You really can't build the mine without dealing with the Forest Service land use restrictions.
That reminds me of a couple things. First off, we have that same problem with 3 Ojibwe tribes. They also have a claim to this land, and a land swap will be necessary for them. We saw this week at the Senate hearings that the tribal spokesman said that we weren't really in this EIS much. We have objections and they were eliminated. And then we heard from the head of the DNR say that the contractor didn't think that their objections were valid. So I think that the Ojibwe tribes may actually not be very hot for a land swap, because currently I don't think that they feel they're being listened to, at least by the project people here. So that
the project is in the 1854 treaty area where the Ojibwe tribes of Minnesota retain certain rights for hunting, fishing, and gathering, and on public lands.
Right.
And since the mine site is currently part of public lands and national forest lands, the tribes are very concerned about how that how a land swap would impact their ability to exercise their treaty rights on comparable acreage.
That will be interesting to see how that plays out. It makes you kind of wonder if in the next few years we won't employ more lawyers on this than miners.
Well, I'm sure that given all the controversy and the intense feelings on multiple sides of this issue, that certainly the Corps of Engineers and the DNR, as the agencies that are doing the environmental impact statement, are well aware that they need to put together a defensible record in the likelihood of future lawsuits.
One other thing, we have this draining towards Lake Superior, but don't we currently have more commitment to cleaning up Lake Superior than ever before?
The Great Lakes have always been a high priority for EPA and the federal government, and I think that has been heightened by the Great Lakes Legacy Act and some of the other initiatives and major new funding that is coming to the Great Lakes for a variety of different protection and restoration activities.
Could you explain the
details? We're very eager to see more done on the Great Lakes.
Could you explain the details of that? Have we raised the bar for what we want to do in Lake Superior? As in that the mercury emissions here that will trickle down to Superior.
One thing you may want to do, we have a web page within the EPA.gov website that is very explanatory on the Great Lakes Legacy Act and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative.
I will go there.
So that would be a good place to get some detail on that. But I mean, we're looking at habitat preservation, restoration. We're looking at removal of contaminated sediments from places known as areas of concern where we know there are existing problems, and then we want to protect the watershed as well. So, including restoring habitat and dealing with invasive species. Just about any aspect of the Great Lakes ecosystem that is experiencing any distress right now is going to be targeted by this multi-pronged EPA program.
I wonder, too, if we might be more enlightened in 10 or 20 years, and we may wish to reduce the level of mercury again, because it looks like a toxin that we used to totally ignore, and we seem to perceive its importance more and more.
Well, in all Minnesota, as I understand, Minnesota has a statewide, what they call a total maximum daily load. It's a
right. There's not really a lake you can just eat from.
Reducing mercury, because mercury is pretty commonly found in Minnesota surface waters, and that's primarily due to air deposition from a variety of sources,
coal,
including coal-fired power plants. But we do expect that this particular mining project is likely to mobilize additional mercury, and that's already an issue we're concerned with.
I have a little aside to you, and that is I have a love affair with that Boundary Waters canoe area. Are you at all personally familiar with that? It's a pretty famous place.
I have done a couple trips up there.
Then you know about it very well. I am great. Here's a couple interesting things about it. Since it was clear-cut 100 years ago, we might not think about maybe preserving it as much as restoring it, because you actually have to look hard for the original trees to go and find them. And then I recently talked to Will Steger. I don't know if you know him, but he's a pretty famous naturalist. And
yeah, and actually, isn't he the polar explorer who's based in the Twin Cities?
Exactly.
Yeah, and he came here and gave a presentation, an all-employee presentation a couple of years ago. It was a pretty fascinating couple hours.
He's an interesting guy. He doesn't like being inside. I asked him, what's the #1 thing I could photograph, Will Steger, to show climate change in Minnesota? And the first thing he thought of was oaks in the Boundary Waters. So in a way, we might be wanting to think about more restoring the Boundary Waters than preserving it. It's maybe something that we're already having to worry about. I think that we're drilling awfully close to it. By the time we drill in Birch Lake, which is right at its edge, you can hear that inside the boundary waters. And of course, the drainage from that will go right into it. So we have interesting problems up the road.
The drainage from the North Met mine is in the Lake Superior Basin.
Right, I understand.
Boundary waters, as you know, are in the Hudson Bay watershed. But I have heard that exploratory drilling in Birch Lake and some other areas are they're within the watershed that drains into the boundary waters. So that's a separate issue that I'm sure many people are watching with great interest.
I don't really expect you to have an opinion on that, but I just thought I'd tell you my opinion on that. And I guess let's get to our last important question, which is this. What's the future here? I guess we have Plan A and Plan B. Plan A is we don't do a thing, and you're probably going to want to stop this project. Plan B is we have to alter our proposal. So I'd like to discuss what happens. What would happen if they didn't change a thing? What would you do at the EPA to stop it? Do you go to your, what is it, the Environmental Quality Council?
Let me briefly explain that. Again, this is a very rarely used process, but by virtue of us giving this project an environmentally unsatisfactory, inadequate EIS rating, that lays the groundwork for potential future referral to the White House Council on Environmental Quality. That referral, if it were to occur, would happen at the time of the final environmental impact statement, and would only happen if we felt that our issues had not been addressed to the point where we could back off of that rating.
So largely, that probably won't happen because they know the result of that.
Well, and what CEQ does is that one of their functions is to arbitrate environmental disputes between federal executive agencies. So if this project remained environmentally unsatisfactory with an inadequate EIS at the time of the final environmental impact statement, then we would have a basis for referring it to CEQ. CEQ's normal practice when they are presented with a potential referral is to go to the disagreeing parties and say, try to work it out. I'm expecting that we will see revisions to this project. This project has evolved over time since we first encountered it, and you know, we're hopeful that that evolution can lead to satisfactory technical resolution of our issues. I mean, that's our goal. We're not in the project killing business. We're in the project improving business, if you will, and we're fully committed to working with the other agencies and with the company to see how our issues can be resolved. And don't forget, there were 3,700 other commenters on this project, all across the spectrum, some of which devoted substantial resources to generate their own detailed technical comments. The Corps of Engineers and the Minnesota DNR have to come up with a game plan for how they're going to respond to all those comments. And I think, given the visibility of this project and its importance to the environment and to the economy of northern Minnesota, that the involved parties are going to work very diligently to see if this project can be done safely.
It's not good for your economy if it costs you $1 billion later to clean it up.
I agree that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're in rulemaking on financial assurance at the federal level for hard rock mining, is because we don't want to see, proliferation of cleanup sites from mines that were improperly designed, closed, and cared for post-closure.
I like when we use the word in economics, true costing. We want to look at the true cost of this, not the temporary cost of it.
But we certainly feel that the economic consequences of a project need to be fully considered before that project goes forward. That's the whole point of doing the environmental impact statement. That's what the National Environmental Policy Act was intended to do, is to ensure that federal decision makers fully analyzed and considered environmental impacts in their federal decision making. And in this case, the federal decision is the Corps of Engineers wetlands permit decision, and then also the Forest Service decision relative to a possible land swap or a land sale.
Is there anything else you would like to say, Ken? I think that's all I can do today here. I might have to call you back because I think that you've been very important and I might need something in the future, but I think you've really helped me.
You're welcome to. My direct line is 312